So the ENSO outlook for this spring is forecasting a neutral phase to take place as we approach the month of April and May. But the beginning of spring, the phase should be more of an El Nino as the sea surface temperatures right over the equatorial Pacific are still well above average. But eventually we're going to see those sea surface temperatures cool down close to the average at a point where we're going to feel neutral-like conditions this spring. And that'll play a big role in terms of what we're going to see. Since the majority of the spring we're going to experience a neutral phase, it's best to take a look at what typically happens during a neutral phase in the United States. So we clearly see that we do see a more pronounced jet stream dip right over the northern Midwest as well as the Northeast, and that allows a cool air mass to move further southward, and that brings typically colder than average conditions. Now, of course, this is a winter pattern, so it might not be completely accurate, but for the most part, this should be around the ballpark in terms of the type of conditions you should expect this spring. And we typically see the conditions a little bit more moist than average right over the southeast, so you definitely need to be aware of that possibility of potentially severe weather occurring with a subtropical jet moving through, and of course with a jet stream dip that's a little bit more pronounced like we typically see during a neutral phase, because that'll certainly raise the instability for those severe thunderstorms as well as tornado threats to develop in the southeast, especially during the early part of spring, more so right around March and April, which is typically tornado season for you guys in the southeast. But if we were to shift our focus a little bit further westward, we see that it's typically warmer than average right over the southwest. However, I do think that this year this could be an exception regarding the warmer temperatures. I think along the coast of California it's a little bit more likely, and along the Pacific coast in general you're more likely to experience warmer than average temperatures, especially later during the spring, because with the warmer than average sea surface temperatures we're less likely to see morning fog develop right up along the west coast. So if you live along the coastal cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, you're less likely to experience that intense fog that you would see typically during the later part of spring into the early summer, as it's typically referred to as May gray and June gloom right up along the west coast. I don't expect it to be as pronounced this season thanks to the warmer sea surface temperatures, which will stabilize the air mass just above the Pacific. So I do expect it to be a little bit warmer thanks to that. However, during the early part of winter, I think it'll sort of cancel it out because we're still going to be in an El Nino pattern during the early part of the spring. I meant to say spring. I think I said winter before. I do apologize for that. I meant to say spring. So for the month of March, the El Nino pattern should still take hold of much of the United States, so we still should see pretty powerful troughs move up along the west coast. That will certainly bring down the temperatures at least close to the average or slightly below average for the early part of the spring. Before I do eventually expect the temperatures to be warmer than average, but for the most part it should be a little bit more moist and cooler than what you'd expect, at least compared to what you see during an ENSO neutral pattern. So definitely keep that in mind going into this spring. After taking a look at what typically happens during an ENSO neutral pattern for the United States, it's time to raise the bar and our cups to the stars by taking a look at a more reliable forecast, which is the composite climate division plot, which definitely shows which temperatures, how the temperatures compare to the more long-term average between 1991 and 2020 for neutral years, since we're most likely going to be in a neutral ENSO pattern. And as you can clearly see, it's simply colder than average for much of the United States, with it being a little bit more pronounced right over the mid-Atlantic and Northeast and portions of the Southeast and the Rocky Mountain ranges as well. So I do believe that this will be a good indication of what type of temperatures you see. However, based on the temperature scale you see on the bottom, you see that the intensity isn't that high. It's only around 1 degree Celsius cooler than average, which is certainly enough to at least be aware of, but it could definitely be outweighed by another factor. Let's say potentially warmer sea surface temperatures or a drought going on for this specific year. It could definitely be outweighed by that, but considering the fact that this is what typically happens during a ENSO neutral pattern, and that we don't really have a drought or much warmer than average sea surface temperatures right up along the western Atlantic at this time, I do believe we're more likely to see a colder spring for much of the East Coast, and it'll be compounded by the fact that we typically see more moist than average conditions during ENSO neutral patterns for the spring, especially for the southeast. So I think that will also contribute to the temperatures being cooler than average. As for the West Coast, I don't think the magnitude is that high to the point where you take this very seriously, because it's only 0.2 to 0.4 degrees cooler than average on average during ENSO neutral pattern, at least on the below average spectrum. So I do believe that it'll be outweighed by the fact that the sea surf temperatures over the Pacific are warmer than average. So don't take this very seriously, at least right up along the western half of the United States, based on my perspective. As for the precipitation anomalies we typically see during ENSO neutral patterns during the month of spring, we see that it's typically drier than average pretty much right over the Ohio Valley, and this extends into Texas as well, and even portions of the Pacific Northwest and Northern California do experience drier than normal conditions during ENSO neutral pattern. So this is something to keep in mind as well, while the east coast of the US experiences slightly more moist than usual conditions. So this makes you believe even further that the southeast will experience more moisture than usual, more storm systems than usual, and potentially more severe weather as a result of the higher frequency of troughs that are expected to move through. And same goes for the northeast as well, while for places like the Ohio Valley and portions of the Pacific Northwest, you should expect a drier than average spring. I also want to point out the differences we see during different ENSO patterns when it comes to severe weather. And as you can see, during a La Nina phase, we see that the chance of that the tornado frequency is a lot higher throughout the United States, especially the Midwest. And then when we take a look at the frequency of hailstorms between a La Nina pattern and El Nino pattern, we see that hailstorms are far more frequent during La Nina patterns, which makes me believe that severe weather in general is more likely when we see a La Nina phase take place. Now, of course, at least during the early part of the spring, while it will be an El Nino, we're eventually gonna move into a neutral phase for the majority of the springtime, and so we should see probably an average amount of severe weather this spring for much of the United States, since the conditions will be right in between what we see in an El Nino pattern and a La Nina pattern. So we should expect an average amount of severe weather. But remember, whether the amount of severe weather is above average or below average, you still need to remember that all it takes is just one storm to completely devastate a community. So you definitely don't want to underestimate any sort of severe threat that approaches your area just because, let's say, it might not be a La Nina pattern, because we still could see very significant severe weather threats even during a neutral or even an El Nino pattern. So definitely stay prepared for any severe weather threat that approaches your area, no matter the forecast. Another thing that'll give us a good indication of what to expect this springtime, we see that temperatures are typically cooler than average, or at least what the computer models are stating is that we should see cooler than average conditions this spring for the months of March, April, and May, which goes in line with what we typically see during an ENSO neutral pattern. And however, for the northern United States, we should expect warmer than average conditions, especially for the northern Midwest, which does sort of go against what we see during a neutral ENSO pattern, because typically during a neutral pattern we see that the temperatures are cooler than average for the northern United States, more specifically the northeastern half of the US. So it is definitely different from what we see, but we also have to keep in mind that the northern Midwest is currently under a drought, and when we see a drought, it's more likely the temperatures will be warmer than average, since there's a pretty strong, because not only it's due to the fact that for a drought to occur in the first place, we have to see a strong amount of ridging that will deter a lot of storm systems from moving in and potentially cooling down temperature, but also it's due to the fact that when the surface is very dry, there isn't a lot of water to act as a buffer when reducing the amount of the temperature or the amount of energy along the surface. So the surface heats up a lot quicker when it's drier rather than when it's a little bit more moist. So it sort of goes in line with what we've been seeing over the past several months over the northern Midwest, where it's been rather dry and warmer than average. So I do believe that this will be a little bit more accurate, and this is pretty accurate for the Pacific Northwest, where it's typically a little bit warmer and drier for much of the Pacific Northwest. And then for the southwestern portion of the U.S., we see that there are some areas where it could be cooler than average. And like I said earlier, I do believe that the early part of spring, while it will still feel a lot like winter, it'll feel a little bit cooler as well as more moist than average. I do believe that eventually temperatures should rebound later during the winter, thanks in part due to warmer Pacific sea surf temperatures. But the beginning of the spring should keep the temperatures from being well above average, which is probably the reason why this computer model is forecasting mainly average temperatures throughout the Southwest. And here's a 3-month precipitation mean monthly anomaly forecast from the CAN-SIPS model, as we clearly see that the southeast does experience a little bit more moisture than usual thanks to more storm systems moving through, which again goes in line with what we typically see during a neutral pattern, and it's expected to be more moist than usual right up along the southwest coast. And like I said, it's thanks in part due to the fact that the early part of spring, we're still going to be in El Nino, so we're still going to see storm systems move in and bring more moisture than usual, and it's already been well above average when it comes to precipitation right up along the southwest. So we should naturally expect more precipitation over the next few months as we approach the springtime. But it should be drier than normal right over the Pacific Northwest, which is fairly typical for what we see during ENSO neutral patterns during the spring months. So here's the current drought monitor for the United States, valid as of February 20th, 2024. And we do see some portions of the northern Midwest are experiencing drought-like conditions, and same goes for the Pacific Northwest and headed into portions of the Rocky Mountain ranges as well. And I expect this to continue for much of the northern United States, more specifically the Pacific Northwest, because we're going to enter ENSO neutral pattern, which typically does bring a little bit more drier than usual conditions over the Pacific Northwest. And it's also due to the fact that the computer models are forecasting that the climatology models are forecasting a drier than normal spring for much of the Pacific Northwest. So I expect the drought to only get worse over the next few months. And since we've been under fairly strong ridging for much of the northern U.S. this winter, I expect a lot of troughs to miss out on a lot of these areas. So definitely be prepared for that for much of the northern United States. For the southeast and the southwest, I expect the drought conditions to maybe subside a little bit, at least for the early part of spring, before maybe getting worse, because that's when the El Nino pattern will end, which means that less troughs will approach the New Mexico and Arizona region to potentially help mitigate the drought conditions that are going on right now. So in the places where you are in a drought, you should expect it to be warmer and drier than average for a little bit longer, thanks to the fact that dry surface heats up a lot faster than a moist surface. So expect the temperatures to be warmer than average in those areas. And like I pointed out earlier, we also need to pay close attention to the ocean water temperatures just off the east and west coast, because they could also play a role in terms of the type of temperatures and humidity levels you will see this winter. So for the Pacific Northwest, I'll definitely say the Pacific water temperatures will matter a lot more in terms of the type of conditions you'll experience along the west coast compared to the Atlantic water temperatures, because over the United States, weather moves from a westerly to easterly direction, which means that all the wind will come off the Pacific Northwest coast, while the wind off the east coast will move away. So the Atlantic sea surf temperatures won't have much of an effect compared to what you'll see along the Pacific coast. But clearly, as you see, right up along the Pacific coast, sea surf temperatures are warmer than average, which I believe will contribute to the coast being warmer than average this spring. And also, a key thing is that it should definitely mitigate the possibility of May gray and June gloom developing for much of the Pacific coast, thanks to the fact that the sea surface temperatures will be a little bit closer in temperature compared to the air temperature, which means that there will be less instability to develop that morning fog you'll see right up along the Pacific coast, which I believe will contribute to the temperatures being warmer than average this spring, at least later during the spring months, where the El Nino pattern will subside, and we're gonna inevitably see more sunny conditions as a result of the warmer Pacific sea surface temperatures. And for the Atlantic, while I just said that the Atlantic doesn't play as much of a role, it still could play a role, especially right up along the Gulf of Mexico, since a warmer Gulf of Mexico could contribute to a little bit more humidity and convective activity developing, which could definitely enhance the possibility of severe weather and just heavy rain threats in general. And as you can see, most of the Gulf Coast is experiencing sea surface temperatures warmer than average. We do have some small patches where it's colder than normal, but I do believe that the warmer sea surface temperatures will add a little bit more fuel to the fire when it comes to severe weather and precipitation right over the southeast, and this will also move into the northeast as well. So you definitely want to keep that in mind as we approach the springtime. So here's my official spring forecast. So up along the East Coast, you should expect temperatures to be colder than average this spring as well. And you should expect more storm systems moving through the East Coast, thanks to the fact that we're going to be in an ENSO neutral pattern. We're going to see a pretty strong subtropical jet continue to bring storms right up along the southeast, and combined with the fact that the computer models are also forecasting in the next 3 months to be more moist than average right up along the East Coast, it's definitely asking for the precipitation to be a little bit more than usual. So definitely expect more storm systems this spring and a more wet spring for much of the East Coast. Now, taking a look at the Southwest, expect the early part of spring, more sickly March, to be more stormy, thanks to the fact that we're still going to be in an El Nino. Of course, that will subside by the time we approach April and May, where I do believe those 2 months will be a little bit better when it comes to the amount of sunshine you'll receive, and when it comes to being a little bit drier, thanks to the fact, and it's thanks in part due to the fact that we're going to see the Pacific sea surface temperatures be warmer than average, which I believe will contribute to less clouds developing right up along the coast. So it should be a little bit more sunny and warmer during the later part of spring for the Pacific Northwest. And as for the Pacific Northwest, you should expect the conditions to be warmer and drier than usual, as you guys will stay up all night till the sun, and you're definitely gonna stay up all night to get some, as the sunshine will be shining for quite a while right over the Pacific Northwest, thanks to the drought conditions you're going to be experiencing, and it's expecting to continue on and potentially up until the summer. So this is my spring forecast for 2024. Make sure to comment down below if you want more specific forecast for your location. I'll make sure to reply to you guys to give you guys a more in detail forecast. So comment down below if you're interested. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.